Thank you so much, Matthew, and I am glad to join you again. So many great presentations this afternoon. What I'd like to talk to you about, what my final presentation is going to be on, is really practically based, and it's for those people that are in districts where there's some danger in terms of engaging controversial topics. And I want to provide a strategy for thinking about how you can talk about some of these topics. So what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon for about the next 40 minutes or so is how to teach by proxy and how to comment by proximity. And I want to begin by talking about the dangers of playing cover-up history. And when I talk about cover-up history, what I mean essentially is what we saw in 2020 when people were making these false comparisons between nonviolent protests associated with Black Lives Matter and what happened on January 6th with the Capitol insurrection. And that cover-up history is dangerous because if you don't understand the foundations and the ways that Professor Jeffries talked about, or Kelly Carter Jackson yesterday, or others, then you are prone to make these types of comparisons, which are problematic because they're largely ahistorical. I want to give you a very good example of this using two political cartoons from the last couple of years. And they pivot around the question that Dr. Michael Butler raised not too long ago in his presentation when he said, how do we discuss complex things in contested spaces? Well, the way that we do that is we can teach by proxy and we can comment by proximity. In other words, I never really have to go into a classroom and engage a subject directly because history is so broad. If we're thinking about this in the terms that, in the ways that Thomas Jefferson or more importantly, John Lewis talked about, there's always a historical parallel that I can use to broach that subject. So these two particular cartoons are great. Mask mandates then and now. Ironically, the first was state of Florida and others upset over people masking because of COVID. But now with the banned books, those masks go over people's eyes. So they don't want them to see. And then the banning of literature. And when you're thinking about this, what are you gonna base this on? I mean, what is the purpose? What's the glue that's going to hold this unit together? Well, I would suggest that we look at a legal scholar by the name of John Smach, who argued, I think this is powerful, that one of the ways to kind of get at the complexity here is to talk about how American nationhood rests upon what he calls a civil theology. I love this, right? And that civil theology is largely composed of three things. The principles of the Declaration of Independence, not the Declaration itself, but the principles that are articulated there. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, so on and so forth. The preamble to the Constitution. Now, why the preamble and not the Constitution itself? Because you're not going to find core democratic values in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. You are going to find core democratic values in the aspirational language of the preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, so on and so forth. And then last but not least, he says, and the elaborated rights of the individual is found within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights itself. And then we can look at this in terms of the expansion of the Bill of Rights, in terms of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, so on and so forth. Now, why is this important? Well, when you play cover-up history, what you end up doing is denying young people the opportunity to appreciate the complexity of how this civil theology informs most of our discourse about civil rights in this country. I want everybody for a minute just to think about Congressman John Lewis's response to Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. And so what does John Lewis say in response to the Supreme Court gutting key sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? John Lewis's argument is both historical. He's going to attack this on the basis of history, but he's also going to question the actions of the Roberts Court on the basis of a violation of that civil theology. What are you talking about, Yohuru? What are you talking about, Dr. Williams? Follow me here. John Lewis says, I was disappointed because what I think the court did today is stab the Voting Rights Act of 1965 right in its very heart. We may not have people being beaten today. Maybe they're not being denied the right to participate, to register to vote. They're not being chased by police dogs or trampled by horses. But in the 11 states of the old Confederacy, and even in some states outside the South, there is a systemic, deliberate attempt to take us back to another period. I would submit to you in 2013 that John Lewis called what's happening in 2023 around banned books and efforts to restrict and deny the teaching of African-American history. Because John Lewis could see that this political moment with regard to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was basically basically the opening act, the opening salvo. And these men that voted to strip the voting rights and to pass the so-called literacy test. Remember Dr. Scott from the other night? It took us almost 100 years to get where we are today. So will it take another 100 years to fix it, to change it? John Lewis is appealing to history here. He's saying, we fought this battle, and our ignorance of history, our willful denial of that history means we're going to set ourselves back. We have to reinvent the wheel. It is also Pauli Murray's appeal to A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King at the March on Washington, when in both a public letter published in the Washington Post and in private communication to Mr. Randolph and Dr. King, she says, you didn't include women. And because you didn't do that, you know you're setting us up for having to come back and do this in another couple of years, because we could have just knocked all this out the park right now by saying, instead of a march for jobs and freedom, let's just include gender and get it all out of the way. John Lewis concludes, my message to the members of the U.S. Supreme Court is, remember, don't forget our recent, and if you can see it on your screen, if you're with me now, I want you to say it with me, don't forget our recent history. It is an appeal to history. He continues, walk in our shoes. Come and walk in the shoes of those 3 young men that died in Mississippi while registering Black voters in 1964. He's talking about Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. He doesn't have to name them, because he knows that half the people who are witnessing this in 2013 remember that history. And if they don't, he's challenging people to go and look it up. He continues, walk in the shoes of those of us who walked across the bridge on Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. He's talking about Selma. And John Lewis concludes, I don't think on that day when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act that I would live, because this is the importance of history and constant struggle, that I would live to see 5 members of the U.S. Supreme Court undo what President Johnson did with those pens. In other words, that in my lifetime, what we fought and shed blood for could be undone by the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, and how we ultimately might be partly responsible for that because of the ways in which we voted or didn't vote, the ways in which we acted or didn't act, the ways in which we were indifferent to the danger, the real danger, to that civil theology that we pledge allegiance to. Don't lose me here. I ain't got much time with you. I want to talk about this in terms of censorship, because I'll have teachers come in and go, I would like to, Dr. Williams, talk about what's happening in Florida in terms of the banned books. I would like to do this, but you got to understand there's jeopardy here. Like, if I talk about this directly, I might lose my job. And so again, I say, don't talk about it directly. Teach by proxy, comment by proximity. Because there are abundant examples to talk about censorship in U.S. history that would give you the opportunity in a very nuanced and complex way to raise the issue. And then you just engage your students with questions. And the fact that, Holmes and Brandeis were taking heat from their colleagues within the legal community who said, you went too far in articulating this clear and present danger test. So a few months later, they get another bite at the apple in a case called U.S. versus Abrams in 1919. And in that case, Holmes and Brandeis dissent from the majority. Now, even though they had articulated this clear and present danger test, in the Abrams case, they end up dissenting from the opinion that they had established this test. And I want to read to you, because I want to make the point to you, twofold. Number one, that sometimes the minority opinion becomes the majority opinion, and in a democracy, that's very important. Sometimes you can be on the right side of history, the wrong side of a decision, and ultimately be vindicated by history itself. See Plessy versus Ferguson and John Marshall Harlan's dissent in Plessy from 1896. Because what was the minority opinion in 1896 becomes the majority opinion in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And I want to tell you, it didn't take that long for Holmes and Brandeis, but I want to read to you Justice Holmes' dissent in Abrams, because it's powerful. And I'd like to address this, if I might, to Governor DeSantis and Youngkin and others. Persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power and you want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. To allow opposition by speech seems to indicate that you think that speech is impotent, as when a man says he squared the circle, or that you do not care wholeheartedly for the result, or that you doubt either your power or your premises. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths. They may come to believe, even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. It is an experiment, as all life is an experiment. Every year, if not every day, we have to wager our salvation upon some prophecy based on imperfect knowledge. While that experiment is part of the system, I think that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law that an immediate check is required to save the country. Now, for those of you who can't connect this on your own, allow me to break down what Justice Holmes is saying here. He's saying that over time, we've had many situations where people believe that some thought was going to be the undoing of our society and our culture. And ultimately, what has happened is, in their effort to suppress that thought, they've done more damage to our democracy in the process than would have been accomplished by simply allowing for the free trade in ideas, for those ideas to get accepted, as he puts it, in the market of ideas. But my favorite part of this is when he says, every day, if not every year, every year, if not every day, we wager our salvation on some prophecy based on imperfect knowledge. I want to ask some of you that flew in, how many of you question how you got here on that plane? We hop in automobiles, we put these cell phones up to every day, if not every year, we base our salvation on some imperfect knowledge. And his point is, in a democracy, the theory of our Constitution is that that's healthy, because that discourse builds strength. In this particular case, Holmes and Brandeis were dealing with a group of socialists who had actually been convicted of violating the Sedition Act because they had thrown some leaflets off a roof. With the backdrop of the Abrams decision, a guy by the name of Meyer London is elected in New York, and he's a socialist. Ha ha. Now, immediately, there'll be some conservatives in our country that are triggered by that word. But I want to read to you Meyer London, once he is in Congress, pushing back against immigration restrictions. And I want to read to you what Meyer London, who has a school named after him in Queens, which is actually an immigrant school today, largely Asian Chinese population. I want to read to you what Meyer London writes in 1921 during debates over immigration restriction. He says, "Mr. Chairman and gentlemen, the world is crazy. The war is not over. After preaching for thousands of years the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and then engaging for 5 years in the slaughter," that's World War I, "it is but natural that we be in an abnormal state. But while the killing of men's bodies has stopped, the poisoning of minds has just begun. This bill to restrict immigration is a continuation of the war upon humanity. It is an assertion of that exaggerated nationalism which never appeals to reason and which has for its main source the self-conceit of accumulated prejudice." It's what we call speaking truth to power, calling a spade, being very clear about the prejudice that's informing this debate. He continues, "At whom are you striking in this bill? Why, at the very people whom a short while ago you announced you were going to emancipate. We sent 200,000 men abroad to make the world safe for democracy, to liberate these very people. Now you shut the door to them. Yes, so far we've made the world safe for hypocrisy, and the United States incidentally unsafe for the Democratic Party, temporarily at least." And if that don't sound familiar, but it's his conclusion that I find the most powerful. He says, "The supporters of the bill claim that the law will keep out radicals." Ha ha. The idea that by restricting immigration, you will prevent the influx of radical thought is altogether untenable. You cannot confine an idea behind prison bars. You cannot exclude it by the most drastic legislation. Let me repeat that. Governor Youngkin, Governor DeSantis, Mr. Abbott, Mr. Russo, and others. You cannot confine an idea, a curriculum, a history behind prison bars. You cannot exclude it by the most drastic legislation. The field of thought recognizes no barriers. I hope over the last 24 hours, coming up on 24 hours, and the incredible body of scholarship that we brought to you, that you recognize that anything that you do to restrict that thought has made barely a dent in what demands expression. He concludes, the fact that there were almost no immigrants during the war did not prevent us from importing every abominable idea from Europe. We brought over the idea of deportation of radicals from France, not the France of Rousseau or Juarez or Victor Hugo, but the France of the Bourbons. We imported the idea of censorship of the press and the passport system from Russia of Nicholas II. We've imported the idea of universal military service from Germany, not the Germany of Heen or Bone or Fringarth, but the Germany of the Kaiser. And America, United States, wasn't immigration that brought in these ideas of censorship or restricting our history or racial oppression. He concludes, ideas can neither be shut in nor shut out. There's only one way to contend with an idea, and that is the old and safe American rule of free and untrammeled discussion. Every attempt to use any other method is always proven disastrous. Now, the other day, my friends, I read to you from Ronald Reagan, and today I'm reading to you from the Gospel of 1921, Meyer London, and also, just to be clear, from the dissenting opinion of Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis. And I make this case to you because ultimately, in the South, when y'all was naming schools after Confederate generals, in New York at least, they were naming Meyer London Middle School after Meyer London because they recognized the power of that thought. Now, both can exist simultaneously, but in a world where, or in a society where you allow for those ideas to compete, truth wins out in the free trade of ideas. What does this have to do with teach by proxy, comment by proximity? In that wave of anti-Asian hate that we all experienced after the pandemic, I had a lot of teachers saying to me, I want to talk about this in my classroom, but I'm concerned that it will be perceived in a particular kind of way. I said, well, you just got to give. Suni Lee won the gold medal. What are you talking about, Dr. Williams? When Suni Lee won the gold medal, she had some very important remarks to make about the significance of that moment. Now, I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul right now, and she's from Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what Suni Lee said after she won the medal and after she did the Wheaties commercials and all that good stuff, what she said was, I'm a Hmong American who was born and raised in Minnesota. I grew up in Minneapolis. The Twin Cities has the largest Hmong population in the nation. And yet to this very day, I run into people who have no idea why the Hmong are even in the United States. They have no idea the role we played in American history. Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Youngkin, this isn't critical race theory. This is culturally responsive teaching, the other CRT, that the curriculum should reflect the community that makes up those people that live in proximity and who therefore are contributors to the body politic and to the culture of that place, like the Hmong in Minnesota or the Somali in Minnesota, that curriculum should be reflective of those experiences so that people like Suni Lee grow up, not in a society where they're excluded or invisible, but where we see pluralism and diversity as a strength. Now, when she says this, and again, people were, I don't understand how you connect that, Dr. Wish. How does that solve my history problem? I go back to Challenger and Ellison Onizuka. Didn't you tell us about Challenger yesterday? I did, but I didn't finish. Ellison Onizuka, Japanese American, grows up in Hawaii's ancestors were subjected to the Japanese internment. And when I talked about the civil theology, if you study those Japanese internment cases, remember, the crux of those cases is those weren't immigrants, those were American citizens who were being denied their basic rights as citizens based on their ethnicity. In the Hirabashi case, you've got Gordon Hirabashi saying, as an American citizen, I wanted to uphold the principles of the Constitution, and the curfew and evacuation orders which singled out a group on the basis of ethnicity violated them. It was not acceptable to be less than a full citizen in a white man's country. I need people to understand that What Gordon Hirabashi is naming in 1943 is white supremacy. People get very uncomfortable when you talk about that in the DE&I program. They go, that's Kendyism. That's wokeism. Oh my goodness, this is new. This terrible thing, restrict it, hide it, get rid of it. I go back to Justice Holmes. I go back to Meyer London. And now I go back to Gordon Hirabashi, who said, no. These are those core democratic values. This is the civil theology which we all buy into. This is the bargain that you're violating when you engage in behavior like this. Look, I told you I do the history. Let me do it very quickly. I do it with two political cartoons. One is from 1879. It is very disturbing. It shows a Chinese immigrant speaking to an indigenous person, Native American person, and they're reading all the laws in the 1870s that have been passed to restrict Asian immigration. See, we think about this as a 20th century phenomena, but it started much earlier. And as he's reading over this list, the Chinese problem, prohibit Chinese immigration, laws for their banishment, foreigners not wanted, patented by the Irish, lager beer government, social order of Fritz, no nothingism of the past, down with the Irish, down with the Dutch. What Thomas Nast is attempting to do here, the political cartoonist, to say, the stuff that you're doing to this group of people are the very things that you at one point were subjected to, and your ignorance of history is allowing you to perpetuate it in a way that you're undermining those principles, which we all have to believe in, that civil theology, which in some sense becomes a repudiation of the very society you claim. I love the caption here. It reads, red gentleman to yellow gentleman, pale face afraid you crowd him out the way he did me. I think is cute. But in the back, if you look very carefully, there's an African-American gentleman who's sitting on what appears to be a bale of hay or a retaining wall, and over his head is written the words. Keep in mind, this cartoon is 1879. Over his head is written the words, my day is a coming. This is 20 years before Plessy versus Ferguson. Because in America, we telegraph our punches. One last cartoon by Thomas Nast, the following year, 1880, shows a Chinese immigrant being lynched or attempted to be lynched by a group of American citizens. The caption reads, we don't want any cheap labor foreigners intruding upon our native-born citizens. Now, look, I'm going to make some people uncomfortable, but I got to do what I got to do. When Trump was making all that noise, right? And I'm not being political in saying that. I'm just being clear, because if the parallels are there, I can teach by proxy and comment by proximity. When all that foolishness about Mexicans and protecting our border and inherent criminality and so on and so forth was taking place, I was drawn to this political cartoon because I wanted to make a point. Because Thomas Nast did something here that I think was brilliant. He depicted the mob as being composed of Irish, German, Italian, and African Americans, not because those were the people who were doing the violence against these Chinese immigrants, but because those were the people who should have been most sensitive to the violence that was being done against those immigrants. My friends, when you teach by proxy and you comment by proximity, this whole world opens up so that you're not getting these manufactured Marvel movie moments. The guy didn't need the Marvel movie with the manufactured moment of the girls coming together of all different shades to go, game on. I didn't need that. I got that with the Olympics with Suni Lee and Simone Biles and all these beautiful women of color and white women and immigrant women who won a medal for the United States because it is our diversity that is our strength. It's cultural pluralism that produced those moments. But the only way those become moments of victory is if we face the history that's ugly, so that we can talk about how that is real change. Not that we're where we need to be, but it maps where we might be if we overcome these hurdles based on racial division. Let me give you one more. I got to do this. Got to do it. Shirley Chisholm, love Shirley Chisholm. When Hillary Clinton ran for the nomination, you had people saying it's the first woman. All of us was like, nah, Miss Shirley. We know Miss Shirley. Now, when Shirley Chisholm ran, and I want you to just pay attention to the language she uses. In laying out her campaign, she said, I was the first American what? See, her and Gordon Hirabashi and all these people are playing the same game. They're claiming their citizenship. I was the first American citizen to be elected to Congress in spite of the double drawbacks of being female and having skin darkened by melanin. She named something there. white supremacy and sexism. Today we go, that's DE&I. That's wokeism. Nah. In the words of Hassan Jeffries, that's just truth. It's a hard history. It might hurt. Have mama kiss the boo-boo. Because that's the history we have to face. She says something here that puts her in conversation with Michelle Obama from 2008 when Barack Obama won. And people got upset when Michelle Obama said, this is the first time in my adult life that I've been proud to be an American. People said, see, he should be president, right? But what Michelle was saying is no different than what Shirley Chisholm said here. When you put it that way, that I was the first person in 192 years to be at once a congressman, Black, and a woman, that's a foolish reason in a just and free society for fame. And she concludes that I was the first person in 192 years to be all those things I think that our society is not either just or free. She said that in, please tell me, Charles, I haven't gone down. Good, because I don't got much time left. And in that way, you have her making this case, I think in a very powerful way about this, that what we're dealing with here again is not new, but teach by proxy, comment by proximity. I'm speaking specifically to my educators. I don't ever have to go in and talk about Hillary and Trump. I can go and talk about Miss Shirley. I don't have to talk about, I never have to mention Ibram Kendi. I can go in and talk about Miss Shirley. I don't have to name white supremacy, but I don't know how you not talk about it when you're talking about her campaign from 1972 and her saying, hey, here are these two things that have limited opportunity for American citizens historically, race and gender, and when they're wedded, oh. And see, people get real upset because they say, you know, these things can't exist at the same time, but they can, because we can lionize people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, right? They did great work in pushing for gender equality for women. But I'd like to remind people, and this is just the history, truthful history, that when women were denied, when the 15th Amendment failed to address the question of suffrage for women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony had an opportunity in that moment. They had allied with the abolitionist movement to make a statement. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1869 delivers a speech in which she says, in response to the 15th Amendment, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish, I want to point out, because you can't make this up, I showed you a bunch of political cartoons from Thomas Nast from 1879 and 1880, where Thomas Nast is playing with the same language, right? So there must have been something in the ether, there must have been something in the culture in that moment that she would be speaking to this in a speech, and it would be reflected in the cartoons that says that white supremacy and sexism are a thing in that moment. But look at how she responds, because you go, well, where's the white supremacy? You're just shaming white kids and making people feel bad. I don't have to do it. I'm just reading from the document, the primary source. But I want to be clear. She says, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish with their low ideas of womanhood to make laws for you and your daughters, to be your rulers, judges, jurors, to dictate not only the civil but moral codes by which you shall be governed, await to the danger of your present position and demand that women too shall be represented in this government. But here's the problem, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It wasn't Chinese, African, German, and Irish men that denied you the right to vote, because they weren't in the legislature. They weren't in the Congress in that moment. It was your husbands, your brothers, your fathers, your sons that did that. And you raging against the people who were not empowered means that this is an appeal to, wait for it, white supremacy. Because the only American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement would be those women who are in contrast to the Irish, German, Chinese, and African that she identifies. Now, Mr. Youngkin, Mr. DeSantis, I understand maybe they didn't do this at where you went to school, but that's why people attend the Ohio State University and study under my brother, Hassan Jeffries. That's why that happens. That's why people go to Hood College and study under people like Terry Ann Scott. That's why we exist. That's why there's African-American studies. That's why there was that AP course. This is healthy for democracy to talk about things like this. Don't lose me. I'm almost done, I promise. But I'll tell you something. 3 years before Elizabeth Cady Stanton had her meltdown, African-American school teacher named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper saw the writing on the wall and spoke to it. In 1866, she delivers a speech entitled, "We Are All Bound Up Together," where she's appealing to that civil theology. And she says something powerful in that speech. She begins, "I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life." Thank you, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Because we contest for the right to vote, and then we realize that the right to vote ain't really worth the hill of beans if people aren't willing to do the work after that to make those core democratic values real. But she goes one step further. She says, "I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men," and I want to be very clear, like us all, they may be divided into 3 classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. Ha ha. The good, she writes, would vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote with the strongest side of the question with the winning party. When the election took place, I put this on my Facebook page. I tweeted this. I was messing with people. People were like, "This is Dr. Williams has such a cogent analysis." I was like, "That's Frances Ellen Watkins Harper from 1866. Ain't nothing new about that." But she goes one step further, and I think this is what I want you to take away from this 24-hour teaching, but more importantly from this presentation. She says, "You white women speak of rights. You white women speak here of rights. Listen carefully. I speak of wrongs." I got to say that again. You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. When I asked you to be the challenger, I'm going to ask you to, for a second, to think of the difference between speaking of rights as opposed to speaking against wrongs. Because there's a difference in the way that Wilmer Leon and Clarence Williams and Kelly Carter Jackson and Ivory Toldson and Michael Butler and Ashley Farmer and Hassan Jeffries and even little old me connected that for you. She concludes, and I love this: "I, as a colored woman, have had in this country, listen carefully to the language because there's a method to my madness. I, in this country, as a colored woman, have had an education which is made, have had an education which has made me feel in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow and take my seat in one of your streetcars. I do not know what they'll do in New York, but in Philadelphia, the conductor will put his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride." This is 1866, and she's talking about being Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks, Mary Miles before Mary Miles, and Elizabeth Jennings after Elizabeth Jennings. And if you don't know any of those references, then I suggest you go to a state where you can have African-American history taught in your curriculum, because that'd be the only way you could speak of wrongs and push for a nation in which we prefer rights. I'm way over time, but I want to end with you on this note. I promise you I'm going to end here. Promise, but I'm probably making that up. I want to give you one last example of teaching by proxy, comment by proximity. I had a lot of teachers contact me on social media and say, "Dr. Williams, I would like to talk about January 6th because my students came to class and they saw what happened and no one is explained." See, I like to talk about teachers as critical first responders. We don't like to think of them in that context, but as a former K-12 educator in Washington, D.C., I want to let y'all in a little secret. I spend more time with your kids than you do. When your kids have questions and they leave you at 7:45 in the morning to hop the bus and spend the day with me, you know who's going to answer those questions? Either me or the kids they hanging out in the schoolyard with. And you best believe I'm equipped to answer those questions with far more care and diligence than their classmates. Dr. Williams, how are we going to talk about January 6th? We can't talk about, I said, don't talk about January 6th. Teach by proxy, comment by proximity. Teach Little Rock, because it's the same situation. Because if you look at Little Rock in 1957, and you look at the response of Dwight David Eisenhower, what is Eisenhower saying in response to people storming or preventing 9 children from entering Central High School? He says, proper and sensible observance of the law is demanded and has to be obeyed. The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon a certainty that the president and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the courts. And he goes on and on and on. But my whole point here in saying this is that Eisenhower in this moment as president did the right thing in ensuring our civil theology. Whereas in 2021, by contrast, I don't have to say it. I just ask my students to ask questions. Let's compare other moments in which people marched on Washington to make their voices heard in the manner in which they conducted themselves and how the government responded accordingly. I cleaned that up real nice. Teach by proxy, comment by proximity. It goes deeper than that because even in that moment, you can get Eisenhower being hypocritical. Why do you say that, Dr. Williams? Eisenhower says, a foundation of our American way of life is our national respect for law. Ha ha. In the South, he continues, as elsewhere, citizens are keenly aware of the tremendous disservice that has been done to the people of Arkansas in the eyes of the nation, that is done to the nation in the eyes of the world. At a time when we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communism bears toward a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and influence, indeed to the safety of our nation and the world. Mr. Eisenhower, communism didn't produce that. Good old-fashioned American white supremacist hatred produced that. And oh, by the way, if you don't think that he was being serious, here's a article from the Manchester Guardian from 1957, Little Rock Dilemma Resolved, Eisenhower Redeems Honor of America. And here's some international responses to January 6th. Which are making essentially the same, teach by proxy and comment by proximity. And because look, I have to live to fight another day. We use those contrasts. It allows us to even move beyond the easy ones. Like when you show up at the Capitol with a noose, and then you pretend you don't know what a noose signifies. When I can go back and read Alexander Stephens' Cornerstone Address, when you show up with a Confederate flag and you go, well, the Confederate flag is a symbol of American heritage. And no, Junior, not quite. Let me read to you from Alexander Stephens' Cornerstone speech, March 21st, 1861, where he says, our new government, the Confederacy, is founded on exactly the opposite idea of those core democratic values, that civil theology that I shared with you in the very beginning, which he articulates in the first paragraph. And if I had all day with you, I would read. But because I don't, I'm just going to go to the second paragraph, where he says, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that Black is not equal to white, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. That is white supremacy. So if you've got a Confederate flag and you're trying to tell me it's Southern heritage and you're trying to and somehow disentangle it from what Stevens said and defined as a cornerstone of the Confederacy, you're going to get a D on that paper because that's a gentleman's D too. It should be an F. We talk about these core democratic values. We look at this in the sense, I'm going to end on these 2 slides. Nobody does this better than my brother. In fact, it's so great to be with him today in particular. But when we talk about images, I love this image of Selma 1965, and it equates the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Washington crossing the Delaware. See, Americans always want a tragedy with a happy ending. Like we like big cartoonish pictures of our history that is always this American, but it's messy. And I like, if I'm teaching by proxy and commenting by proximity, the messiness of John Kennedy in June of 1963, calling segregation and civil rights a moral issue. Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Youngkin, the curriculum, DE&I,
not disruption, indoctrination, or whatever the other words you use were, but diversity, equity, inclusion are a moral issue. Allow me to quote John Kennedy, Mr. Governor. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scripture and as clear as the American Constitution, two of those foundations upon which our civil theology rests. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we're going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school, if he cannot vote for the public official who will be representing him, if in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which we all want, including a curriculum which is reflective of his experience and contribution to the... No, he didn't say that, but I put it in, but it fits. I want to end with you by talking about what happens when you don't deal with that history and its complexity. And I want to do that in one slide. I want to talk about a woman worker who is reflecting on the so-called good war. Because this, again, is what I mean by Americans' desire for a tragedy with a happy ending. Like, we want this cartoonish U.S. history, which is not. It's complex. It's complicated. It's like your Facebook status. It's complicated. When it started, she began, this war was the greatest thing since the Crusades. The patriotic fervor was such at the beginning that if the Star-Spangled Banner came on the radio, everybody in the room would stand up at attention. So she's writing this about the 1940s, but I want to remind some people in this room that aren't that old, and some of you at home that are watching, remember Gulf One? When Whitney Houston sang the national anthem at the Super Bowl, where you couldn't go anywhere without seeing an American flag and people lost it? Because that moment was parallel to the moment she's describing. And then it got complex. She says, as the war dragged on and on, we read of the selfish actions of guys in power. We read stories of the generals like MacArthur taking food right out of the guy's mouth when he was in the Philippines to feed his own family. Our enthusiasm waned and we became cynical and very tired and sick of the bloodshed and killing. It was a completely different thing than the way it started. At least this is the way that I felt. So she's being very honest and saying my experience is different than what is being projected. But it's the second part that's the most important. She says the good war, that infuriates me. Yeah, the idea that World War II being called the good war is a horrible thing. I want us to think about this for a second. In what universe is war ever good? Except for the victor who has to justify the bloodshed and killing that was accomplished to win the war. She continues, I think of the atrocities. I think of a madman who had all this power. I think of the destruction of the Jews, the misery, the horrendous suffering in the concentration camps. In 1971, the year I was born, I visited Dachau. I could not believe what I saw. There was one barracks left, the model barracks. You can reconstruct the rest and see what the heck was going on. It doesn't take a visit to make you realize the extent of human misery. And that, my friends, is the purpose of history. And that's why I'm giving you the strategy to think about, if you can't teach it directly, teach by proxy and comment by proximity, because young people need to see and experience this in a way that they understand that these are the things that we don't want to see replicated. That this is how we fulfill the foundations of that civil theology, which John Lewis, some of the people that I idolize and I revere, also found to be foundational. I want to thank you for your attention. I have much more, but I am out of time, and I do not want that big hook coming out for me. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan and to David, and we'll move on with our program. Now, if you are watching on the live stream, don't go anywhere. Hassan Jeffries is going to be in conversation with Bob Zellner. You do not want to miss this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I was just thinking about how every time I'm fortunate enough to hear you speak and lecture, I learn so many new things that, and maybe this is just like the way that I take in information, it like takes me time to process it. It's so much that I like take notes. Like I have to go back and I want to really sit and absorb what you have to share, because I don't know. It just like, it makes me speechless sometimes. I'm like, I wish that I could have had these opportunities, all along, but I'm glad that I'm having them now at least, and that you can share with so many other people virtually as well. But I just love learning from you, and speaking with you and being a part of this with you has been exceptional. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm sure some questions will come to my mind soon after I can sit with it and process it, and I'll be sending those over to you at some point. But I know David's here too. He might already have questions queued up, but thank you.